Good morning, everyone. This is Anna Siefken with Carnegie Mellon University's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. I'm very glad to have you here for another in our series of distinguished lectures this fall. Obviously, we are virtual. Most of our events have always been in person, but very glad to have you joining us actually from all over the world, including our special guest today, who is joining us from Germany. So the Scott Institute, I'm Anna Siefken. I just want to introduce myself. I'm actually the Executive Director for the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon University. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Scott Institute. So we are the hub for energy-related research at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so we really focus on collaborative research, strategic partnerships, policy outreach, entrepreneurship, and education. So obviously this session is a part of our interest in not only those strategic partnerships, but also in education for our students. And welcome to so many of our students and students from other universities who are on the line today. So our overarching goal is to really head towards a sustainable, low carbon energy future. We have three main areas of expertise. We like to call them in technology, efficiency, and computation. So if you were interested in learning more, we have our brand new hot off the presses annual report called Impact, which is available on the front page of our website as of last week. So that's cmu.edu/energy, and you can get all the information about us. So the goal for this series, as always, is to bring together our most esteemed partners to talk about important energy topics that are driving all of us. We have a number of events that are coming up over the next 2 months through December, and then we take a short break. Our students will return on February 1st, and our program will resume. So the first is we have an American-made Solar Prize event that I'll speak to in just a minute on the next slide. But first, I want to let you know about a couple of upcoming events. In fact, we have 3 events, including today, that are specific to nuclear policy. So Jessica Lovering is a PhD, a recently named PhD with Good Energy Collective, who will be joining us on October 29th with her new organization, Good Energy Collective. We have a session on November 12th focused on unlocking solar potential with a government agency out of Pennsylvania, a corporate entity, and a law firm. On November the 17th, we have our next distinguished lecture, which is Denise Gray, who's the president of LG Chem out of the Michigan Tech Center. And she's going to be talking about electrification and EVs in mobility and transport. We are partnering with the Tepper School of Business this year, again, as we did last year, on their Technology, Sustainability, and Business Forum on November the 20th, which is a Friday. And then finally this semester on December 3rd, our final distinguished lecture is going to be with Rita Barenwall, who's the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the DOE, who's going to be talking about nuclear energy again. So very excited about all of these events. One in particular I'd like to mention is this DOE American-made Solar Prize Regional Connectors Networking Session. So as many of you know, we are a power connector for that program, which really means we help to bring together investors and technologies and labs to support teams that are working in solar. So we have a networking event, just an opportunity for us to meet each other, for you to meet some startups, for you to meet investors. It's on October the 27th from 3 until 5 p.m. Eastern. So if you have an idea for a topic or a speaker suggestion, we welcome them at any time. You can reach out to my colleague, Daniela Grieman, at this address and add that idea to our list. There are other ways that you can get in touch with us as well. We are on Facebook, on LinkedIn. This is our email address, our website, and also on Twitter. So we appreciate all of the different ways that you follow us. So a special thank you today to Westinghouse. I'm going to go right in with our speaker and his bio. So our featured guest today is Patrick Fragman. So Patrick became the Westinghouse, and I think, Patrick, I'm going to flip to you for just a minute. Are you live? There you are.
Yes, I'm here.
Patrick, Yes. So Patrick Fragman became the Westinghouse Electric Company's president and chief executive officer in August of 2019. He's been involved in the nuclear industry for nearly 30 years as previous head of Alstom Power's nuclear business, as well as working in various energy-focused roles within the French government, including as industrial, energy, and nuclear safety advisor to the Minister of Environment and Land Planning in the early days of his career. So prior to Westinghouse, he was the senior vice president of ABB's grid integration business, where Mr. Fragman was accountable for the industry-leading global portfolio, delivering leading power transmission systems, services, and software. So prior to joining ABB, Mr. Fragman spent 15 years at Alstom, which is a multinational leader in power generation, power transmission, and rail infrastructure. So while there, he held a series of positions in Canada, China, France, and the United States to develop and manage teams, project portfolios, and businesses on a regional and global scale. And today, obviously, we are very global, as you are in Germany right now. Is that correct?
I'm in Switzerland.
In Switzerland, apologies, you're in Switzerland today.
Switzerland.
So yeah. Let me go back to sharing the slides. I do want to mention that if you have a question during our session today, we'd love it if you put it in the Q&A and we will pick up those as we go. So let me share my screen again. And we will get right into your presentation. So, Patrick, please take it away.
Thanks, Anna. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on the area of the world where you are. Today's discussion will be indeed around nuclear energy, and more specifically about the place that nuclear energy holds, and hopefully will continue to hold in our energy mix. We all enjoy having access to energy, and in particular to electricity, which is of growing use globally. But do we all understand the impact electricity generation has on climate change? Next slide, please. We cannot necessarily rein in easily energy demand. Energy demand continues to grow with the development of many more human beings on this planet. What we can address and what we can harness is how we source our energy. The energy pattern we've used for the past 150 years is unsustainable. It leads to a situation with an increase in the global temperatures, a rise in sea levels, a drastic reduction on the ice caps, overall a string of substantial impacts on population, on economies, on environment, climatic events, and so on. This is not a fatality. Nuclear can help us to generate in a clean way a substantial share of the electricity we need so that we can develop in a more sustainable way. For this, we need to probably reverse a certain number of misconceptions and put on the table some hard facts on nuclear energy. And I'll introduce that with the case of a country which is Denmark. Denmark has, like any country, two faces in the medal of electricity, consumption and production. And those two faces of the medals tell two different stories. On the left-hand side, you have the consumption story, and on the right-hand side, the production one. Denmark is a country which has demonstrated for decades a very strong commitment to protection of the environment. Denmark has nurtured some of the biggest champions in the renewable industry and is at the forefront of the renewable revolution. When Danes are looking at the electricity they consume, they are happy about the low carbon content. This is the left-hand chart, which shows the consumption view. However, the reality is that this low carbon content is largely due to imports of clean electricity from Sweden and Norway. These are the arrows that you can see. And more specifically from the nuclear and hydro plants in these two countries. Nuclear alone represents 80% of the total electricity consumed in Denmark. Denmark electricity generation by itself, the domestic piece, this is the right-hand side of the table, has a pretty poor carbon footprint content. It's mostly based on gas and coal. What I presented here on Denmark could be extended to many countries, including Germany and Austria, which has declared a crusade on nuclear. So what does this picture tell us? it tells us, among other things, that it's high time for decision makers to revisit their views on nuclear, face the reality, and look at the facts. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, if we do care about the fight against global warming, nuclear is part of the solution. It's not the only solution, but it is a key part of it. Over the past 50 years, nuclear power avoided globally 55 gigatons of CO2, nearly equal to 2 full years of global energy-related CO2 emissions. Every year, nuclear-generated electricity saves our atmosphere from more than 528 million metric tons of CO2. CO2 emissions that otherwise would come from fossil fuels. These 528 million metric tons of CO2 are about equivalent as 111 million cars off the road, which is the whole number of cars in the US. So that gives you an idea of the impact nuclear energy can have in terms of CO2 emissions avoided. Pursuing the analysis, no other sources, renewable or otherwise, contributes as much to meeting energy demand in all its dimensions as nuclear. In the US alone, almost 20% of the electricity generated is coming from the nuclear fleet. However, 55% of the carbon-free electricity in the US comes from nuclear, thanks to its high availability and dispatchability. And the comparison doesn't stop here. In the next chart, we will see that a lot of attributes of modern energy systems are fulfilled by nuclear power. They operate at a very high level of availability. They have the highest capacity factor as an energy source. They produce maximum power more than 90% of the time. In contrast, renewables also have a great environmental impact, but they are intermittent. They are variable sources. As a result, these type of plants require backup power source. We mentioned Germany is shifting away from nuclear, so I want to highlight that the wind energy capacity factor figure for Germany is around 17 to 20%. And unfortunately, and it's particularly the case in Germany, in too many cases today, coal and gas are used to balance the renewables, whereas it could be nuclear balancing the renewables. So let's summarize the views around capacity factor and what happens, for instance, that's the following slide, please, when a nuclear plant is closing. Let's take a typical nuclear reactor producing 1 gigawatt of electricity. We cannot simply replace it with 1 gigawatt coal or renewable plant. Based on capacity factors, we would need about 2 coal-fired power plants or 4 renewable plants, each of 1 gigawatt size, to generate the same amount of electricity on the grid. So what are the main issues which are today put on the back of nuclear energy? Let's start with safety. We cannot talk about nuclear energy without talking about nuclear safety, and safety is core to our industry. It's existential, and in the mind of many people, nuclear energy is seen as unsafe, and it's even feared. The reality is that nuclear power is far, far safer than any other fuel. On this chart, you have not only depicted the greenhouse gas emission potential and emissions on the horizontal axis, but also the overall death rate on the vertical axis. All energy sources have negative impacts to a certain extent, but those impacts differ enormously in the size of those impacts. Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? That difference can be easily summed up by all metrics. Fossil fuels are the dirtiest and the most dangerous. Nuclear and modern renewable energy sources are vastly safer and cleaner. Nuclear energy results in 330 times fewer deaths than coal, 250 times fewer deaths than oil, 38 times fewer deaths than gas. And as you can see on the chart, modern renewables are generally as safe as nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is by far the safest energy. And it's true whatever the parameter you may want to use, number of deaths as shown here, or even the amount of radiations. Surprisingly, the coal-fired electricity generation emits more radiation than the nuclear sector. So let's switch to another factor, which is which is to consider, which is power density. Power density of nuclear energy is unbeatable. Let's take a small element of fuel, which we load in a reactor. We call this element a pellet. It's about a 40-gram type of pill. This pellet contains the same amount of energy as 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 1 ton of coal, or 120 gallons of oil. And this pellet enables, as we have seen, access to carbon-free electricity. Let's talk about nuclear waste, which is also one of the usual arguments put in front of nuclear energy. First, it would be fair to say that whereas the nuclear industry concentrates and tracks all of its waste, the other sources of electricity generation disseminate their waste and their emissions in the environment. So to give you an idea of how concentration works, the US has generated since the 1950s about 83,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel. This is about the size of a single football field with a depth of less than 10 yards. We could say, for instance, it's a football field for the Steelers in Pittsburgh. By comparison, coal plants generate the same amount of waste every hour. So on the management of the waste, there are also a vast portfolio of solutions which are available to manage the different types of radioactive waste. These methods and technologies are safe, and they just require decisions to be made. Let's switch now to the costs, which are often presented as another weakness of nuclear energy. And I'll use here a recent International Energy Agency report, which looks at levelized cost of electricity across the board, and in particular, this chart is about the US picture. What is presented on the slide is that the LCOE of existing plants is among the lowest of all fuels. And what is true for the US is also true for many other countries. What is true for existing plants is also true and can become even more true for new plants, provided we put in place proven success factors to keep the cost down. These success factors can be, for instance, making sure we have a fleet effect, making sure we have an affordable financing. And I'll give examples in those two areas. First, fleet effects. At Westinghouse, we built 4 AP1000 units in China recently. Between the first and the third unit we built, we could already observe a double-digit cost reduction of the total plant costs. Looking at the financing, this is a key factor impacting the economics of the nuclear plants due to the duration of their construction. This is why we are very supportive of the recent inclusion of nuclear among the projects that the US DFC can help. DFC support combined with the US Exim Bank support are a big step which can benefit any customer worldwide through competitive financing. Let's switch to the future, and how does the future of nuclear look like? And let's start maybe with new large reactors, since in that case, the future is already here. Let's start with the AP1000. We have a realistic view of what investments in new builds can do for the industry. The Westinghouse AP1000 nuclear power plant is the most advanced Generation 3 nuclear reactor deployed in the world today. It's the only reactor which is deployed with a completely passive safety system. It sets a real benchmark in terms of safe nuclear operations. We have 4 units which were commissioned in China, in Sanmen and Haiyang, and they are all in steady commercial operation today. They have completed their first operating cycle, they have completed their first refueling outages, and they are generating more power than their initial rating. With the completion of these AP1000 units, design was finalized and proven, first-of-a-kind risks are eliminated, licensing is complete, supply chain is established, construction methods, modular construction methods are proven and optimized, and operational performance are demonstrated. Our Chinese customer at a recent public event mentioned how much these new units are performing on the Chinese grid. The first outage on Sanmen 1 lasted only 46 days. The first outage on Haiyang 2 was only 30 days. We are also completing 2 US plants based on this type of reactor. When those 2 US plants in Vogtle will be put on the grid in the next couple of years, they will be the first nuclear power plants being built in the US in several decades. Another area of innovation are microreactors. Microreactors are a type of innovation that shatters our previous expectation of on-demand, carbon-free energy. Microreactors are essentially smaller versions of traditional reactors, but they can fulfill very different use, such as batteries for stationary or mobile applications. They are typically defined by three distinctive design features: factory-built, transportable, and self-adjusting. Microreactors are smaller fission reactors, like large plants, but they do not necessarily use water as a coolant. In Westinghouse case of microreactor, we call it eVinci, the technology is based on passive heat pipes. Smaller units designs make microreactors very transportable, which allows us to ship the entire reactor by truck, by a vessel, by an airplane, or by a rail car. The design is simple and responsive. It requires very few components and therefore less maintenance. From a cost perspective, they are very competitive in remote areas that rely on continuous diesel fuel supply. Those areas must pay both from cost and shipment. This shipment is usually costly, is environmentally unfriendly, can even be dangerous, and is unreliable. Microreactors provide a longer core life. They can operate between 3 and 10 years without refueling. They can then be quickly removed from sites and exchanged with new ones. Our eVinci is a next generation small nuclear battery for decentralized generation markets and microgrids, such as remote communities, remote industrial mines, and critical infrastructure. Westinghouse is also bringing its unique industry use of its technology. Our robotics teams are working to commercialize aerial drone inspections. This is an area of cooperation and collaboration with CMU. We've been working for many years in the robotics area with CMU. This application shown here allows to detect cracks in structures using drones and having automatic recognition techniques. This new service improves safety. It avoids costly scaffold builds. It reduces on-site time. It creates a database to track the condition and monitor the evolution of the cracks. In the future, our drone technologies will be paired with machine learning to automatically detect flaws in concrete, steel, coatings, and do predictive modeling. As many of you know, nuclear technologies is also more and more used in a variety of medical and agricultural applications. Approximately 1/3 of all patients admitted to US hospitals are diagnosed or treated using radiation. Nuclear medical imaging, which combines the safe administration of radioisotopes with camera imaging, helps physicians locate tumors, size anomalies, and other problems. Doctors also use radioisotopes to kill cancerous tissues, reduce the size of tumors, and alleviate pain. This year, Westinghouse announced a partnership with a Canadian company, Nordion, to develop new isotope production techniques, which will allow cobalt-60 isotopes to be produced in pressurized water reactors. Cobalt-60 plays a critical role in the safety of medical devices, in the treatment of certain brain cancers. It's also used in food sterilization to reduce pathogens in food. As we continue to innovate, we can anticipate additional uses for nuclear energy that go beyond the production of electricity. This is an exciting field of development for nuclear energy and for Westinghouse. Let's have a quick talk now about Westinghouse Teams. As a company, we've always valued innovation and process improvement. We are leveraging our lessons learned and incorporate that knowledge into our projects and operations worldwide. We created a global operating model that functions as the engine of Westinghouse. It focuses on excellence in delivery, in manufacturing, in engineering, and supply chain management. Through this engine, we created global competency models across all the divisions to effectively utilize and deploy our overall talent pool where they are mostly needed, which is next to our customers. Overall, a substantial portion of our investment plans are also developing the skills and capabilities which allow us to remain at the forefront of technology. So, as we conclude, let's recap some key energy challenges we've gone through and what Westinghouse is committed to do around these challenges. We're effectively committed to designing and supplying safe solutions for clean power, which are key for baseload and even for flex load generation, which is now needed as renewables are making more inroads in the energy mix. We're also committed to help our customers to operate their existing plants at the highest level of safety and performance. We're committed to continue to invest and innovate to enable nuclear energy be part of the sustainable energy mix, especially as energy systems are transforming, integrating more renewables, demanding smaller reactors for different applications. We can do this in an overall framework which acknowledges that nuclear energy is definitely part of the solution to many energy issues. So how do we get to that point? We need to reframe our thinking around nuclear. We need to look at the facts objectively and comparing the various energy sources. We need obviously to extend the life of existing plants, at the same time investing in new facilities. This is an imperative in many countries, as well as accelerating the adoptions of new reactor designs, especially of smaller scale. In a nutshell, this is our response to the energy challenges of today. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions.
Patrick, thank you so much for that presentation. We have a number of questions that are coming in. And so those of you that are putting your questions in the Q&A, that's awesome. If they're in the chat, I'm going to also try to get to them, but please do put your questions in the Q&A because then we can make sure that we can get them. Let's see. So the first question I have is actually, before we dive into these questions that are coming in rather quickly, which is great. Thank you very much for that presentation and for the work that you're doing. We certainly appreciate it. Our first question actually came in advance from Josh Gould, who's at our local utility, Duquesne Light Company. And his question is, does Westinghouse have a structure around how and where they innovate? And if so, can you describe that?
So we do have a structure, and this structure is evolving. It's evolving in particular due to the fact that as many companies, we are embracing digitalization to embed that in our offering. And this requires substantial changes to the way we were innovating. Westinghouse has a very long track record in innovation, and this innovation pattern was largely done in-house. We had a certain number of collaborations, and I mentioned one with CMU in particular, but this was, I would say, to a certain extent, more the exception than the rule. We are opening up more and more to external partners, third parties, and creating an ecosystem of partners innovating with us. And for that, we're not only looking at power generation. I was mentioning a few other areas which are of interest for us. In the digital field, for instance, we are looking at partnering with companies which are operating in very different verticals.
Okay, another question that came in. So Clint Zediak, who works for WGL Energy, said, given the relatively high dollar amount per megawatt installation cost to build new nuclear, what financial incentives are needed for new nuclear power plants to be built in competitive energy markets, such as PJM, NEPOOL, and or ERCOT?
So I think it's a great question, and it has two parts in the question. The first one is the mention of the high cost. And as we have seen, it's not an obvious thing because countries which have made a choice to have a fleet can clearly reap the benefits of those fleet impacts. And that's fundamentally one of the issues of nuclear energy. We've been through decades where many countries, including the US, were building many plants. At that point in time, there were great learning curves, great costs that were achieved. And it made really those plants very competitive. We've lost track in many countries. We haven't built nuclear plants for decades. It's about 30 years in the US. And obviously that has an impact when we want to build a new one. It's loss of skills, lots of knowledge, lots of capabilities, and loss of the supply chain. So what we are trying to do now is to reverse that and leverage economies of scale across the fleet. Now to the second part of the question, what can be done in the US energy system? I think the first thing is to give nuclear energy a fair chance and to put it on equal grounds as the other sources of energy. So in particular, access to financing is definitely an important piece, but also the fact that today, one of the fundamental issues that the energy systems are facing, which are CO2 emissions, is not really tackled, at least not tackled in a consistent way across the US. There is no carbon price that could effectively be a level playing field across all the fuels. And that has definitely an impact in the decision-making of quite a few energy decision makers.
Okay, another question. What are your views on a blend of renewables, gas, and nuclear in the future? So technical limits to renewables in the grid?
So the answer to that is yes. There are technical limits to renewables on the grids, and there are countries which have a very large share of new renewables and installed capacities in renewables, which today operate without blackouts only because they are very well connected. But there are issues which are not only the variability of the load. There are issues linked to system inertia. There are issues linked to voltage control, frequency control. And in my previous role, we were installing all the systems that are used by the grids to moderate and to a certain way mitigate some of those impacts, especially when you go to very high level of renewable penetration, let's say above between 7 to 10% renewable penetration inside a country mix. So you do have impacts, which, by the way, are very rarely taken into account when presenting the cost of electricity of renewables. Those are external things which are obviously on the taxpayers' money, which are effectively needed in order to integrate the renewables, including the backups. And take the case of Germany. Today, the backups are coming from lignite, which is, let's say, a wet form of coal, so even less efficient than coal, and gas. And all those backups cost around 20 to 30 billion euro per year to the German taxpayers. So the cost of the energy transition has to be taken looking at the overall cost of this energy mix.
A question's come in from Sarah Pfeiffer. She wants to know what steps you mentioned taxpayers. So what steps can just customers or citizens take to advocate for the expansion of nuclear energy?
The first step is, I think, when we have discussions, and I often have discussions with people who are not necessarily in the nuclear energy, and I welcome to have different views, is try to engage and try to get the people to be rational and to look at the facts. And that's where, especially people who are probably watching this seminar today are, let's say, more educated on those questions than the average people, and can really help to get the facts and the records right. Because things will not change in the overall nuclear framework if decision makers and politicians do not want it to change. And decision makers and politicians will not make this step if opinions are not changing about nuclear energy. Opinions are going in many countries in the right direction, but maybe not at the right speed. Time is running. Climate change is already passed beyond the point of sustainability. And we are now in a mode where we are more trying to do damage control and try to orientate how we are going to manage the years to come than trying really to mitigate the impacts that we could already foresee more than 3 decades ago. So changing the opinions is the first step, and that will trigger a certain number of good decisions in the right direction.
Okay, next question. And there are many questions, so I hope you're okay with this format. What major paradigm shifts do you envision for the future of advanced nuclear systems and associated regulatory burdens placed upon them?
So first, I mean, regulators around the world are always, presented somehow as not necessarily helping. I don't necessarily share that. I think there is lots of willingness around the world with the regulators to try to help the advanced technologies. In many cases, we probably need to be more clear and have more cooperation between regulators, OEMs, and utilities on what are the safety levels of those new technologies, so that everyone can feel comfortable about what we're doing. But in many cases, it's going in the right direction, and as we can see for SMRs, for instance. Now, the question is, how can we accelerate, and what do we see as step-changing technologies? Small modular reactors, microreactors can indeed bridge gaps in many cases. They cannot replace large reactors. Microreactors, for instance, are very different types of uses, more as batteries. And these can be game changers in the life of many people who today have to rely, for instance, on diesel generators. The other part that can be a real game changer are generation 4 type of reactors. Reactors that would really substantially reduce the amount of waste generated inside the reactor, that would even to a certain extent consume waste which has been already stored. And those are things that definitely are a little bit further down the road, but that can also bring substantial benefits overall to the overall cycle.
Next question. And I don't think we'll get to all of the questions. Please keep submitting them, but we may not get to all of them. So Vogtle 3 recently finished cold hydro testing. Congratulations. How does the US nuclear industry build on AP1000 success? And is really any new AP1000 viable in the United States?
So there are several questions as well. So the first one is, indeed, there was this great news which came yesterday of this milestone which was passed on Vogtle 3. As many people have noticed, it came more or less at the same day as Poland announced that it had ratified an intergovernmental agreement with the United States in order to develop a nuclear program. And I believe this is great news for the US nuclear industry, also to foster the solutions that we have into countries which today have a limited exposure to the benefits of nuclear energy. The other piece is nuclear in the US. I think personally, many utilities are very interested to see the results of Vogtle 3 and 4. They've seen that we've taken the lessons of the mistakes we've had at the beginning of those programs and the issues we have encountered at the beginning. And they see now that the execution is going extremely well with Southern, Bechtel, and Westinghouse in particular, being all focused on deploying those reactors on time. So I guess utilities are waiting in many cases to see how those units behave. We don't have too much doubts on the fact that they will behave very well, as we have seen the 4 identical reactors in China. And that will hopefully give the appetite for many other utilities to implement the very same reactors in the US in the next decades.
Next question. I've heard about environmental impacts from nuclear plants using water to stay cool and pumping it into nearby bodies of water. Do the plants you mentioned do this? And how has Westinghouse found a way around it?
So any thermal system uses basically a cold source and a warm source. And the warm source is usually the outlet of the overall steam cycle. So in the case of nuclear plants, you have indeed you might have a few degrees Celsius of differences between the cold source and the hot source and the warm source. But frankly, in all the cases, there is an environmental impact study that demonstrates that those impacts are basically very marginal. So those, I mean, let's be straight. Those nuclear power plants, and in particular the temperature gap that you might have between the inlet and the outlet of the plant, are not noticeable on the environmental life. So it's, again, more of a myth than really something real.
To what extent do long regulatory approval processes make new nuclear an unappealing investment? Do you think this has a substantial impact on the construction of new nuclear power plants today?
So we have to make the difference between existing designs and new designs. If you take the case of the AP1000, this design is licensed. So there is not a need for instance, in the US, this design is already licensed. It's licensed in the UK, licensed in many European countries, licensed in China. So if we have to rebuild another another AP1000 in any of those countries, or to build one, we wouldn't have to go through the licensing process. We've been there, we've done that. For a new design, it would be indeed a different story, and you have to go through a certain number of steps to demonstrate that your design is safe. For having worked a little bit on the other side of the barrier, as you mentioned at the beginning of my career, I worked in nuclear safety more on the regulator side. I think it's the price to pay so that at the end of the day, in the eyes of the public, the regulators have done their job in looking in all the areas and making sure that effectively the reactor that is proposed by utility and by an OEM like us is safe and is considered safe. And that legitimacy creates the trust that the public opinion can have in the way nuclear energy is operating effectively. So of course, it can always be optimized here and there, but I think there is a virtue for the nuclear industry to have effectively a third party, in that case, nuclear safety regulators, have an in-depth review of new nuclear designs so that they can effectively put their stamp on it and in front of the public say, yes, I put my legitimacy behind it. It is a safe design.
Okay. Nuclear power plants are generally inflexible relative to load flowing of high penetration renewables. So this limits its use. Is there any availability to or ability to add flexibility? And I know you touched on this before, but I wanted to honor the question.
Great question. And I'm glad it was raised because, so just to be crystal clear, nuclear plants are not inflexible. It's uneconomical in the current framework of electricity markets to operate a plant at reduced load, but nuclear plants can operate in a flexible way. And by the way, not very far from where I am is France. EDF in France, the nuclear utility, is used to operating its plant in a flexible way, in flex load, for decades. So today, with a nuclear plant, you can go as low as 25, 30% of the capacity, and you can have gradients of several megawatts per minute. Several percents of the total capacity per minute. So this is not what I would call inflexible. It can really be combined with renewables into an overall clean energy system.
Chad Doherty says, thank you for your talk. What is the carbon impact of the mining process and how is it expected to change if new reactors go online? How plentiful is the global supply of radioactive fuel?
So again, a great question. So if you look at the CO2 footprint of the different sources of energy, you will see that for nuclear, and by the way, same for renewables, it's not exactly zero. It's a very small number, but it's not zero. And this small zero represents typically the upstream of the cycle, which is mining, conversion, enrichment type of activities, and construction of the plant, which is overall a fairly minor activity in terms of CO2 emissions. So these numbers are known, they have been analyzed, but again, in comparison to many other fuels, those impacts are marginal, inframarginal.
Is there interest from possible customers like the US Navy for microreactor technology for ship propulsion and electricity?
So I would not comment too much on the use, but we have been selected. Westinghouse has been one of the 3 companies selected by the DoD to work on a government use of one of our microreactors, especially to power the base, the military bases, which are in remote areas and in sometimes very difficult to access. And this came after the DoD analyzed and reviewed how a certain number of war areas had in terms of impacts on casualties. And lots of those casualties happened, in fact, during the transportation of gasoline or diesel to power the remote bases. So having a microreactor in military bases, remote bases, really enables not only to have a reliable source of supply, which is one first benefit, but the second benefit is definitely avoiding casualties, and many casualties, as it has been seen in the past in some theaters.
Lots of questions. Thank you again for all the questions that are coming in. So could you comment on the expected role of additive manufacturing and robotics on the large and small scale nuclear power plants? Obviously of particular interest for Carnegie Mellon.
So I will not go too much in the detail because we have a certain number of programs on that. We have already announced, for instance, that we are starting to deploy commercially some fuel elements and components which are manufactured using AM type of technologies. I'm a strong believer that this will be a revolution in many cases. In the previous sector where I was working, which was more on other fuels, we use them extensively, and I have no doubt that they will be also more and more used in the nuclear industry. So we're working on that, and very excited about what it can provide as additional benefits, not only on lead time and cost, but also additional performance of the material.
So there are actually a few questions on small modular reactors. So how do they feature into your kind of overall strategy, particularly with some recent announcements that have come out about, I think someone mentioned that there were some other companies and recent announcements from the federal government about SMRs.
So again, there are different segments. SMRs usually are, let's say, between 150 and 400 megawatt electrical. Microreactors are really, let's say, 1 to 10. Our eVinci is 1 to 5. So it's really another segment, another type of use and application. And many companies are working on them. At the end, we'll see who is at the finish line. What we believe is that to be at the finish line, you need a certain combination of skills. Of course, you need an innovative technology. You need this technology to reach your market goals, which can be cost of electricity, for instance, if you have a utility focus. But it's also about industrialization. And this is where at Westinghouse, we have already designed, industrialized many types of reactors. So we have a certain amount of know-how on what to do, also in some cases what not to do, and that's part of our learnings. And we believe it's a key asset in that race.
A question has come in about marketing, but I would actually say it's public relations, to sort of re-educate the public regarding the low risk that you've talked about today and improve support. So policymakers obviously listen to the public. So do you all have any sort of like educational campaign that you're thinking about or that you're currently running to reiterate the safety facts that you've talked about today for a larger audience outside of this very sort of business oriented audience that we have today?
So we're part in many countries where we operate, we are part of industry associations, trade associations. In the US, it's the NEI, the Nuclear Energy Institute. And in the frame of those associations, we do carry a large amount of educational actions to, to reach out to different communities. Also on our sites, we have nuclear fuel fabrication sites. We do open door days so that we can invite the families of our employees and anyone who wants to come from the community to just come in and ask questions, and we try to answer as much as we can their questions. So we try really to have an open door and to talk about nuclear in a way that really puts it more in the spot where it should be, which is let's judge it on facts and let's not have emotional ideas about what it can be.
So Sumata D has asked a question. First off, thanking you for your presentation, but there are two questions. So how will the cost of nuclear generation per megawatt hour vary in the future? Is it going to be a variable? And question number two is, can nuclear power generation meet the peak load demand?
So the first question, the first question and the second are in fact connected. In the current energy markets, the only way for the nuclear generators is to operate, to make money, is to effectively work baseload, because they have no incentive or very little incentive work in flex load or to work in a way which effectively allows them to absorb, some of the fluctuations of the other sources. Should those fundamentals be changed, then we can see other patterns of usage of nuclear plants.
Okay.
And then to the cost per megawatt, frankly, the only answer I can give is if the person is interested into buying nuclear plants, we can have a separate talk.
So one of the Scott Institute board members is on the line, Kate Jackson, and she wants to know, are there ways to address the challenges faced by U.S. nuclear vendors who must compete with state-owned enterprises or heavily state-supported companies?
So, I mean, competition is there, has always been there, and will most likely always be there. What we're trying to do now is to work with the US government and to work with the different stakeholders to have a level playing field. And in particular, I mentioned financing during the presentation. This is a huge step that will effectively allow US companies to be at close to a level playing field with other foreign competitors, which very often offer a very comfortable and attractive financing package as they propose nuclear plants worldwide. The other thing is we try to advocate that when we develop a nuclear program with countries, there are no political strings attached. It's a business program. We train the people, we transfer our technology, and Westinghouse has a great track record in transferring expertise and technologies because our technology is present in about half of the reactors operating in the world. So we are trying to do that without having in mind, as some other state-owned companies might have, how to create a dependency. This is not at all on the table with us. There is no real strings attached, and we try to voice that as much as we can, especially to the new entrants in the nuclear field.
I lost my place. Let's see. Are you currently considering fusion reactors?
We have already done in the past a certain number of studies, and we continue to do lots of blue sky studies and concepts at different stages. In some cases, in many cases, actually in partnership with external stakeholders, universities, institutes. So this is not something new. I mean, Westinghouse has already been looking at it in the past. What we have to consider regarding fusion is when will market conditions be effectively open for the fusion case, and something which probably is a little bit further along down the road, given the state of uranium reserves.
So I think we have time for one more question before closing question, sort of the send off for all of us. I'm not surprised by this question at all, but someone would like for you to unpack that robotics. What more about robotics? What applications specifically in robotics do you see?
So, I mean, behind robotics is also artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence can really help solve lots of the complexity issues we have in a faster way, and can also help us to design solutions which the human brain cannot necessarily fathom. I mean, we're exploring, for instance, some types of AI applications for optimizing design, adaptive technologies. We're also looking at applying AI to the way we, we effectively operate. I mean, I like the other parts of the power generation and the energy industry. The nuclear industry has gone through various phases, which of hiring and losing skills, and to that extent, robotics and artificial intelligence can help us to design solutions which also help to manage knowledge in a much better way than what we used to do in the past. So for the specific case of robotics, there are many types of applications, especially when looking at interventions in hot zones, where robotics could be really of great help. And we are obviously working already on that in some cases with our customers, for instance, to do steam generator inspections using robotic tools. We have already great systems available for that.
Fantastic. So as I've opened a poll so that people can give us some feedback on our sessions today, I appreciate the 36 of you who have already answered that poll. Please continue to give us some feedback. You're outside of the United States right now, but we do have two different sort of political ideas that could be in our future. So is there a variation between how they would be handling nuclear, or can you speak a little bit about sort of what the future looks like regardless of what happens in the next month? Can't not ask that question about nuclear.
So I'm going to give you a very easy and diplomatic answer. It's not because I'm in Switzerland, which is a neutral country. It's also because I believe it. It's probably the first time in decades that you have a bipartisan support for nuclear energy in both programs on both sides of the table. So whatever happens, I'm quite confident that nuclear energy will continue to be viewed in a favorable way. What I just hope is that effectively some of the fundamental issues that, for instance, affect the profitability of the existing plants in the US will be tackled probably in a stronger way. That's an important thing, because it's great to foster new technology and to effectively promote and develop new build. It's as important to maintain the existing fleet, which can continue to operate for decades and provide lots of clean electricity to the US energy system.
So any final thoughts are a key takeaway that we should have today in terms of nuclear? Obviously, for the past hour, you've given us a lot of things to think about, but do you have any parting thoughts for us?
No, I would say what I see is after Fukushima, there had been really a very big, let's say, setback in the opinion for nuclear energy. And by the way, again, going back to facts, in the mind of many people, Fukushima is a nuclear accident that had many impacts. The reality is nobody died because of Fukushima. All the deaths were related to the tsunami. And what we talked about, casualties, could also be talked about in terms of environmental impact, which were fairly limited. So going back to that, I think we're now trending into an area where there will be many more people, and there are many more governments which are open to revisiting their views in nuclear energy. I mean, you see it, obviously, US has become very proactively engaged on the nuclear energy in the past years. Canada has always been, but is even more engaged. In Europe, many more countries, including countries that were very little engaged. I mean, Eastern European or even the Netherlands, UK is now largely engaged in nuclear energy. Russia and China are known for years for being very engaged and very motivated in the long run. So many more countries are discovering or rediscovering the virtues of nuclear energy, because climate change is there and requires strong solutions. And I really think nuclear energy can be one part of those solutions.
Thank you so much, Patrick Fragman, for your insightful dialogue today. We certainly appreciate it. And on behalf of the Scott Energy Institute at Carnegie Mellon, we are very thankful for this hour that we've spent together. Thank you to all of you who have finished the poll. Very exciting to see all of the information that you all are sharing. And thank you again, Patrick, for your time. And with that, we will sign off and look forward to seeing you all at a future event. Thank you very much.